This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Thousands of migrant children are being detained in federal facilities across the country while their deportation cases make their way through the courts. In the meantime, the U.S. is required to provide school-age detainees with 6 hours daily of academic instruction. In a new investigation, Camera of U.S. News and World Report asks some tough questions about accountability and oversight of what's turned into a multi-billion-dollar business for the private contractors. She joins us today. Lauren, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
There's a stunning data point in your story. In May 2017, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services had custody of about 2,400 migrant children. Right now, that figure stands closer to 13,000. What happened?
This is really breathtaking when you stop to think about it. And that was from some New York Times reporting, some really great reporting there that they did. They seized some documents that the Senate had and were able to expose how many children are being detained by HHS. And really, it's not so much that there are more children, unaccompanied migrant children coming into the country. It's really that they're staying in the custody of HHS for much longer.
What do we know about these kids? Where are they coming from primarily? How old are they?
They're coming from various different countries in South America, crossing from the border between the U.S. and Mexico, and they really range in all ages. Most of them are between the ages of 12 and 17. There are a lot more boys than girls. Right now, where it stands, I mean, as you mentioned, 13,000 kids, and they're really being housed all over the country. You know, a majority of them are along the southwest border in Texas, Arizona, and California, but they're also in Washington State, Florida, Virginia, and other places.
And what do we know about their educational levels? Any of them special needs? Are there special education students among them? What the U.S. would clarify or classify as special ed?
Their education levels are all over the place. Most arrive with very little formal education, if any at all. Most of them don't speak English. Many of them, as has been widely reported, are dealing with very traumatic experiences, things that they were escaping from their countries of origin. There are children with special needs, and right now it's really unclear whether they're getting the education and the wraparound services and therapy that they need.
These students are spread out across the country, although they're concentrated in some big states, of course, like Texas, Washington State. Are they all entitled to the same educational services, regardless of which state they're in? I mean, are they essentially under federal jurisdiction?
Yeah, exactly. And I was actually surprised to learn that there are federal regulations that set standards for their education. As you mentioned, children in custody of HHS, they have to receive by law 6 hours of education Monday through Friday in core subjects like math, science, history, reading and writing. In most cases, that's English as a second language instruction and physical education as well. Their level of education must be assessed within 72 hours of arrival, and they actually are required to have individualized education plans created for them.
So you reached out to nearly 40 companies that are tasked and have the contracts to provide these services. What was the response rate?
The response rate was unfortunately very poor. I contacted the 38 organizations that have been awarded the most money through federal contracts from the Unaccompanied Alien Children Program, and all but a handful were open to talking to me. They, for the most part, said that HHS had told them not to speak to journalists and to instead refer the journalists to HHS's Office of Refugee Resettlement. But HHS itself wouldn't make anyone available for interview, although they will sometimes email you back answers to questions, at least in part. So unfortunately, we don't know much about how these requirements are being met. It really comes down to finding people who are on the ground and willing to talk to you about what they see, and then sort of weighing whether or not you believe them and finding other people to back up those narratives. And I felt fortunate enough to chat with a very small handful of people who are involved in providing education for these unaccompanied migrant children in some of these shelters.
Well, I definitely want to dig into some of your on-the-ground reporting, but I'm also interested in the 30,000-foot view. Where did you start with this? Where did you get this data? Was it tough to figure out who these providers were?
What I actually did was I looked through websites like usaspending.gov and GovTribe, and those are internet providers that are basically big databases of federal contracts. And you can search with lots of different keywords, and there's advanced searches, and there's all these really neat things that you can do in there to try and track where the federal contract money is going. And then once it gets to those organizations, how those organizations are using it, if they're subcontracting it out to people. And so what I did in this case is I narrowed my focus on the unaccompanied alien children program, which is the federal program that doles out the federal contracts to these organizations that are then responsible for the care of unaccompanied migrant children. So in searching for how that money is spent, I got a list of about 90 organizations. They run the gamut from really large organizations, including places like Catholic Charities, but then some other smaller ones that really focus on the social well-being and therapy for kids. And they might only take, a dozen of these unaccompanied children. So getting that list was sort of where I started. And then I looked at the organizations that are getting the most money and narrowed that down to those who got more than $10 million in federal contracts since 2005. And then I just went point by point and started calling them all.
We should point out that this isn't necessarily a really new rule that these kids be educated this way. And some of these contracts go back to 2015, to the prior presidential administration. And we're talking about billions of dollars, aren't we?
Yes. I found out that since, 2015, there have been more than $3 billion doled out in these federal contracts.
What did you do about finding people on the ground? I mean, I know you were able to get to some of the providers and even to a former superintendent in Brownsville, Texas, who I wouldn't say he was defensive, but he definitely was trying to convey, that they take this job seriously and they have the kids' best interests at heart.
Yeah, for sure. I honestly felt like I was just very lucky to stumble upon these people in most cases. I mean, I did make more than 50 calls trying to track down people from all of these organizations. So eventually I was hoping someone would talk to me.
Yeah, Lauren, that's not called luck. That's called hard work.
Okay. Well, it paid off. And I was able to speak to, as I mentioned, a handful of people, including the man from Brownsville, Texas. As you mentioned, he is the education coordinator for the very large Southwest Key programs. A lot of your listeners probably have heard about the Walmart Supercenter that was turned into a shelter for 1,400 boys, and he oversees that in addition to some of the other Southwest Key shelters all across Arizona and Texas and California. And he was really able to speak to me at great length about, what they do there, the type of education they receive. As you mentioned, he had been a superintendent in Texas for many years prior to his job with Southwest Key programs. But in all honesty, he seemed very genuine and had the children's best interest in mind. But when you start looking at the financials of the organization, that narrative really started to break down a bit.
And one of the things you found was looking for comparisons of per pupil spending with what might be considered the average per pupil spending in the U.S., and it was significantly lower.
Yeah. So if you take the Southwest Key programs, for example, which I just mentioned, they run 26 shelters and they care for about 5,400 children. They told me that they spend $9.2 million on education per year for these children. But if you look at their per pupil spending of a normal public school, which is around $11,000, $12,000, then they should have been spending about $63.5 million. So that's 7 times what they said that they spent.
We're talking with Lauren Camera of U.S. News and World Report about her reporting on migrant children in U.S. custody and the educational services they're supposed to be receiving. This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by the American Federation of Teachers. AFT was founded in 1916 and today represents 1.7 million members in education, health, and public service. Visit AFT.org for more information. EWA retains all editorial control over programming and content. Lauren, we talked about the fact that children are staying in custody longer, which means they need educational services for a longer period of time. Where's this extra money coming from?
Well, it's coming from the federal government. But if you've seen some of the media reports lately, which was one of the things that piqued my interest in doing this story, there have been media reports about the administration pushing back against the Flores Act, which, limits the amount of time government can detain children. So in my mind, that meant that these organizations were going to be getting more money if the children are staying longer. And as I started looking into the story, there are actually a number of media reports about how the White House was already beginning to shift money from some federal programs to the unaccompanied alien children program to sort of bolster the increase in services that they were needed. And so then when I realized that these organizations were required to also provide 6 hours of education every day, I sort of said to myself, well, that's pretty much their entire day. And bingo, a light went off in my head that I should try to figure out how that is all working.
Understandably, these students are being held in these shelters and camps, and I guess you could argue that they're a bubble within these communities, but I guess there also could be an argument to be made to somehow involve the local school districts. You found that's usually not the case. Explain why.
So this is really up to state policies. In Texas, for example, the education department there sent all school district superintendents a directive to essentially not provide any resources or help to the shelters unless HHS was willing to pay for those services. They sort of see it as a double dipping issue, where the unaccompanied migrant children are really supposed to only be using resources from HHS, and providing anything from the district or the state would siphon money away from the public school children, essentially. Other states, though, like California and Florida, seem to have more of a collaborative policy. The folks, unfortunately, that I did speak to in Texas said they really wanted to find a way to pool their resources to help each other out. Most of the shelters there don't have special education services in the districts. That's one of the things that they could provide, for example.
Who's keeping an eye on these programs? I mean, what's the accountability standard here? Is there an annual report? Are there inspectors? Where can reporters find out more about whether these children's needs are being met?
We really have no idea. As you know, the federal government has restricted access to these facilities in the wake of some of the great reporting that's been done exposing the administration's policies of separating families. The HHS has told these organizations that run the shelters and detainment centers that they're not allowed to talk to the press. HHL itself won't make anyone available for interviews, so we really don't know much about how the requirements are being met. There are inspectors that come to these facilities. I do not know with how much frequency they do that. HHS would not tell me or make available any of their reports. So I would just urge all journalists, especially if you have some of these shelters and detainment centers in your coverage areas, to ask away, keep asking for everything you can to try and figure out what's happening with this group of very young, very vulnerable children.
I would also offer as a story idea that reporters look at their local community colleges and talk to adjunct professors and see if anybody else is picking up extra work by helping out at these shelters. And the same would go for reaching out to your teachers union to ask them, are retirees talking about this? Because as your story makes clear, a lot of these folks who are working in these places are already licensed educators.
I would even encourage reporters to call the school principals, call the district superintendents. I mean, if I found one thing universal in reporting this story, it was that everyone who I spoke to from the local public school district really, really wanted to figure out how they could help these unaccompanied minors, and oftentimes had some back and forth with state education department officials. And so it would be weird if there wasn't at least an effort by some of these folks to help out and be involved. So there are definitely stories there.
Lauren Camera is a national education reporter for U.S. News and World Report. She joined us from her office in Washington, D.C. Lauren, thanks again.
Thanks so much.
And that wraps up another episode for us. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.